So, without further ado, I will introduce Tim. Tim's a Professor of Psychology at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois. He's written numerous scientific articles and book chapters on materialism, values, ecological sustainability and quality of life, among other topics. He's also an author of books like The High Price of Materialism and the co-author of Meeting Environmental Challenges. And Tim works extensively with a variety of activist and civil society organisations that protect children from commercialisation, promote ecological sustainability and encourage a more inwardly rich lifestyle than what is offered by consumerism. Tim's been very involved with the Common Cause approach to environmental campaigning, which is how I came across his work, which has been very inspiring to me. So it really gives me great pleasure to welcome him to the stage tonight. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you all for coming out tonight. I really appreciate the chance to tell you some about the work that my colleagues and I have been doing. So let's go ahead and dig right in. So one of the things that's very clear about 21st century Western developed nations is that they are consumer cultures. They're places where we're continually bombarded with all kinds of different messages that are trying to sell us different things. We can see those messages when we get on the internet, when we watch television, if we listen to the radio, open the newspapers. Those are all sort of the standard ways of finding an advertisement or having one come our way. But there are other kinds of places where we see advertisements in the public bathrooms, in the beach sand. There are companies that will put advertisements into beach sand. People rent out space on their bodies. I've seen advertisements on escalator handrails in airports on the bottom of, those trays that you use to go through the airport for security, etc. It's on and on and on. Here is what I consider to be the lowest of the low. I don't really know how report cards work for children in Australia, but in the United States, the report cards are put inside of an envelope and sent home with the child. This is the report card envelope that came home for children in Seminole County, Florida some years ago. As you can see, there's Ronald McDonald down there in the bottom. The other picture is a picture of a Happy Meal. And what it says over there on the left is that any children who had all A's and B's, had good attendance or good citizenship, could bring their report card to their local McDonald's and get a free Happy Meal, thereby promoting good grades and fighting childhood obesity in one fell swoop. Happily, one of the groups that I work with, the Campaign for Commercial-Free Childhood, convinced the school board not to do this any longer. We can also see messages about the importance of consumption in lots of political discourse that we hear about. So, for example, after the September 11th terrorist attacks on my nation, President George W. Bush was asked what could the average American do in order to help the country. And President Bush replied that the American people have got to go about their business. We cannot let the terrorists achieve the objective of frightening our nation to the point where we don't conduct business where people don't shop. 2 weeks later, he was again asked what people could do, and he said, Mrs. Bush and I would like to encourage people to go shopping. I see you taking photos, which you're welcome to do. I'm going to also let everybody know that if you're interested in getting this PowerPoint, my email will be at the end of it, and I'll be happy to send it to you. So just so you know, keep taking photos if you like. Now, personally, I think that any president, Democrat or Republican, probably would have made a statement like this, because 70% of the U.S. GNP depends directly on consumer spending, and that's true, I imagine, in most other economically developed nations like the U.S. And, of course, politicians' fates rise and fall on how the economy is doing. We can also see this tendency towards a more consumeristic society in a wonderful study that Guy Shrubschul did. What he did was he used Google Ngram's program, and he searched over 5 million books published over the last couple hundred years for the frequency of the word consumer or citizen. The blue line there is citizen. Should I just keep the current? Don't show there. That's the one I want. So the blue line is citizen and the red line is consumer. So what you can see here is that beginning in about 1900, 1910 or so, we start to see a strong, steep rise in the use of the word consumer. That coincides, by the way, with the very beginning of psychologists consulting with advertising firms. And then those numbers jump up again substantially as we move post-World War II into the beginnings of what most people consider the true start of modern kind of consumer society. At the same time, around 1970, citizen becomes a less frequently used word in books than does consumer. Shrubsole found the same thing with looking at the Times of London and at the Guardian of London. Both show the same patterns in their newspaper. Now, if we get all these messages about how important materialism and consumerism and consumption is, we should expect that people will take on those messages. And indeed, there's a study that's been done since the 1960s run out of the University of California at Los Angeles, where every year they ask about 100,000 incoming college first-year students what kinds of things are important to them. In this graph, which goes from 1966 on the far end to 2006 on this end, there's three lines here. So the yellow line, which is fairly stable over these years, is the percent who think it's very important or essential to help others who are in difficulty. The blue line is the percentage who say it's very important or essential to be very well off financially. And you can see that that's gone from, say, the mid 40% back in the 60s to above 70% during this time period. I can tell you it's stayed above 70% if we continue this out another 6 or 8 years. Interestingly, the red line shows the opposite path. As people have become more interested in being very well off financially, they have become less interested in developing a meaningful philosophy of life.
How does the red line continue out?
It remains fairly stable as well. So essentially what happens is that we are continually told a variety of messages, that happiness is for sale on the internet, in newspapers, at the mall, and that we can buy things in order to have better lives. We're told that it's important to work and consume. It's important to go out there, have jobs, work long hours so we can make money, that we invest in the stock market, or that we consume so other people can make money so we can keep the wheels of our economy turning. And we're oftentimes told that life is meaningful and people are successful to the extent that they have a lot of money, the right image, and are popular as well. If you think about most of the people, at least in my country, who've made it, they tend to be the good-looking, wealthy individuals who own the things that we're told to want. And I assume that's true in Australia as well. Now, what I've been studying for the last 20 years now is whether or not these messages are true. And what my colleagues and I, as well as other researchers, have found is that the more that people take on these materialistic messages, that there are ecological costs to these messages, there are social costs, and there are personal costs as well. And before I tell you about the research regarding those costs, because I'm a scientist, it's really important to me that you understand how it is we measure materialism and how it is we set about doing these studies in order to test these hypotheses. So there are lots of different ways to measure materialism. I would say that there are two dominant ways to measure materialism. The first one is what we call the values strategy. Oh my, what do I do to this one?
Same thing.
Hide this one?
Yes.
Okay, so the values strategy. Now the values strategy was developed mostly by myself and my colleague Rich Ryan when I was at the University of Rochester. What happens in the values strategy is we present people with a long list of a variety of different kind of goals that they may or may not think are important. So these might be goals like having a lot of fun in life, or goals about being close with your family, goals about spirituality, etc. And we ask them to rate how important these goals are from something like not at all important to extremely important. Now, some of the items that we ask about are materialistic items like the ones that I've put up here. So things about money, about possessions, and about the image and status, which are also fundamental to being a consumer in a modern-day consumer culture. And I'll show you more evidence for that later in the talk. Now, here's the really important part. what we do is we measure, relatively speaking, how important materialistic goals are to all the other goals in the person's value system. Boy, I sure want to walk, sorry. The analogy that I oftentimes use is of a value pie. So what I'd like you to do is to imagine that all the values that you might care about are different slices of pie in a whole value system. What this method allows us to do is to see the relative size of each slice of pie for each person. So for you, for example, it might be that spirituality is a really important value to you. And what this method would do would basically allow us to know that that's a big slice of pie. But maybe for you, spirituality is not so important, in which case it's just a little sliver. Now, of course, what happens is as one slice of pie gets bigger, the other slices of pie must necessarily get smaller, okay? So what we're interested in is the relative importance of these materialistic goals in comparison to other goals that people might want to pursue. Now, all of us have a materialistic slice, okay? All of us have, to some extent, some concern for money and image and status and such like that. The issue to me is how big is that slice, okay? So what I hope everybody sees at this point is I'm not asking the question, does money buy happiness? I'm not asking the question as to whether rich people are happier than poor people. That's an interesting question. Some people ask that. What my research is focused on is the extent to which people buy into the messages of consumer culture and come to believe that these are important goals to pursue in life. Does everybody see the distinction I'm making? Okay, wonderful. Now, the second strategy is much more straightforward than the one I just described, and essentially what these strategies do is to give people items like the ones I put up here on the PowerPoint and to ask how much you agree or disagree with them. Agreement with these items would signal higher levels of materialism. Now, it doesn't really matter for the findings I'm going to show you next. Come on in and sit down. But the findings that I'm going to show you next, it doesn't really matter which way you measure materialism. Either way, you basically get the same kinds of results. So let's talk first about some of the ecological costs of materialism. So one of the things that's clear, if you take a look at the broad historical data, is that many of the kinds of ecological problems that we have in our world today have been associated with the expansion of industrialization, the expansion of nations trying to grow more and more economically. And what this does is it leads to a variety of different practices which involve ultimately polluting the air, polluting water, emitting more carbon, cutting down habitat in order to put up shopping malls and housing developments, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the questions that I've been interested in is, well, do we find that materialistic values are associated with attitudes and behaviors which are bad for the environment? And indeed we do. So for example, there's been several studies that have shown that the more people endorse those materialistic values that we discussed earlier, the worse their attitudes towards the environment. They just don't care about the environment very much. The Saunders and Monroe study, by the way, was done here in Australia and was one of the first studies to find this correlation. To the extent that materialistic people care about the environment or the damage environment wreaks on the earth, they tend to be more concerned for selfish reasons, like their beach house on the coast is going to go under because of bad storm surges and stuff. And Schultz found that, relatively speaking, materialistic individuals have less concern about how the environment might affect. Oh, you know, it said for 5 minutes. I think next time I'll try that. Okay. They have less concern for how how the environment and the damage that's happening in it might affect other people living in poor nations like the Maldives, which is going underwater, how it might affect other species which are going extinct, and how it might affect future generations who will have to inherit this earth we have, given that it's the only habitable planet in the universe that we know of. We also know that materialism is associated with problematic eco-behaviors or ecologically related behaviors. In a great study that Ken Sheldon and Holly McGregor did, he brought people into the lab after having measured their level of materialism, and he had them play this game with each other in groups of 4 where they pretended to be a timber company. And they were given an imaginary forest, and they were told to try to make some profit by harvesting the timber in this forest, knowing that there was a limited amount of timber. It grew back at a slow pace, and that other companies also would be bidding on this. What Sheldon found was that to the extent groups were composed of highly materialistic individuals, as they played this game over many years of the game, people who were more materialistic ended up being less likely to have a forest anymore at 25 years into the game, because they had used up their profit in their desire for greed. We also know that materialistic individuals are less likely to engage in sort of person-level behaviors that help the environment, like riding their bicycle, recycling, using both sides of the paper, etc. That's been shown in U.S. and U.K. children and adults. And materialism is also negatively correlated with the size of people's ecological footprints. So how many of you have heard the term ecological footprint before? So this always warms my heart because I've been asking that question for 15 years now. And when I first gave these kinds of talks, maybe 1 or 2 people would raise their hands. But now, increasingly, I would say between 70 and 100% of people raise their hands. It's an idea which has penetrated the populace. Of course, we've got a special crowd here tonight. You're here for a lecture on the ecology, but nonetheless, it is something that people know more about. If you don't know about it, it's mostly made up of your transportation, housing, and food choices. High ecological footprints happen if you live in a big house. It takes a lot of material to build that and a lot of energy to heat and cool it. If you fly around a lot instead of using public transportation, if you drive a gas-guzzling SUV instead of walk, and then food as well, if you eat a lot of meat, for example, or out-of-season vegetables and fruits that have to be flown in, that will raise your ecological footprint. In a sample of 400 North Americans, Kirk Warren Brown and I found that as materialistic values increased, so did people's ecological footprints. Now, a meta-analysis was recently done by my colleagues at the University of Sussex and me, and what we found, or let me tell you what a meta-analysis is. What a meta-analysis is it's a statistically powerful way to summarize a large number of studies, okay? So usually what happens in science is there's this study, and there's that study, and this study, and that study. What meta-analysis does is to take the results of one study and another and another and another and to combine them mathematically so that you can see the extent to which a particular finding might be robust across lots of different ways of measuring the variables involved or samples or whatever. And so that's what we did in this study. And so to give you a sense, what K means is the number of studies, and what N means is the number of people across those studies. And what we found in this meta-analysis, which as you can see has around 2,500 people in each of the 2 situations we're looking at, the more that people were materialistic, the worse their ecological attitudes and the worse their ecological behaviors. And surprisingly to us, those associations were of equal size. Okay, so materialism seems to equally negatively be related to people's ecological concerns, but also how much they engage in good ecological behaviors. Now, so far, everything I've been talking about is at the level of the person. Okay, so how does this person's materialism correlate with the same person's ecological behavior? In 2011, I did a study where I looked at the level of the nation. So here what I did was I studied 20 wealthy nations, again, including Australia. So hide for ever. 5 hours? Okay, so sorry. So I studied 20 wealthy nations because I wanted to keep national wealth more or less constant, okay? And because also wealthy nations are the ones that tend to have the higher ecological footprint anyway. And I was able to get OECD data on the carbon emissions per capita of each of these nations. And then I didn't have an exact measure of materialism, but what I had instead, which is close, was a measure from the work of a value researcher named Shalom Schwartz, who had data on the values of people within each of these nations. And here, my proxy for materialism is mastery, which is a concern for exploiting the world for one's own self-interest, which is pretty close to materialism, right? Basically, why are you exploiting it for your self-interest? Usually to make money or to have some kind of possession that you want out of the world. And this is in contrast to allowing the world to be as it is naturally. So here what I did was I measured a nation's values against the nation's carbon emissions. And we found, again, a significant correlation even after you controlled for national GNP per capita, such that nations who were more concerned about mastery values were also emitting more carbon per capita. Now, it's not only the case that people's materialistic values are associated with problematic ecological behaviors, they're also associated with problematic social behaviors. So, for example, we know that the higher people score on measures of materialism, the lower they score in empathy or the desire to understand another person's inner state and feelings. I would say that empathy is the basis for any kind of social justice movement. Materialism is also associated with Machiavellianism. Who knows who Machiavelli was? Yes, sir. Who's Machiavelli? What do you write?
I can tell you, I forget, a primer on materialism.
Close. Ma'am, I think you said it. He wrote The Prince. That's right. And what The Prince is it's a primer on how to get power and maintain power. And basically the answer is manipulate people as needed. What some psychologists did years ago was they took quotes directly out of the book, The Prince, and they made it into a questionnaire, and they asked people how much they agree with each of these quotes. And that's how they measure Machiavellianism. They cleaned up the language a little bit to make it more contemporary. McCoskey found that more materialistic individuals also score higher in Machiavellianism, more willing to manipulate others. We also know that materialism is associated with higher levels of racial and ethnic prejudice, as well as higher scores on what's called social dominance orientation. Social dominance orientation is essentially the belief that my group is better than your group, and the reason that your group's not doing so well in the world is because you're lazy or stupid or whatever. Materialistic people are more likely to endorse statements expressing a social dominance orientation. The same happens, same kind of associations are in play for materialism and social behavior. So several studies have found that the more materialistic people are, the less likely they are to engage in pro-social behavior, like helping others, sharing, and the more likely they are to engage in antisocial behaviors like lying, cheating, stealing, engaging in problematic business ethical behaviors. Another great study by Ken Sheldon here took people into the lab after measuring their materialism, and this study brought them into the lab with their friends, okay? And they played a game called a prisoner's dilemma game, which is a famous game used in a lot of social psychological research and in behavioral economics research. And essentially what the prisoner's dilemma game does is allow people to play this game where you can score points either by competing or cooperating. But if you compete, then of course other people don't score points. If you cooperate, maybe you all can score some points. What Sheldon found was that to the extent members of a group scored high in materialism, the group made more decisions to compete rather than to cooperate, again, even playing with their own friends. Now, the longest standing set of research on materialism has to do with materialism and personal well-being. This is where my own research began more than 20 years ago. This is some of what Marcia Richens was studying in a paper on materialism that she published just a few months before my first paper on materialism. And what we know now from literally dozens of studies is that the more that people endorse materialistic values, the lower their levels of personal well-being. This has been shown in numerous nations, again, including Australia. It's been shown in children as young as 10 and adults into their 70s. And it's been shown with numerous ways of assessing people's well-being. And another meta-analysis that should be published in the next few weeks looked at this literature. This is a much, much larger literature than the materialism ecological meta-analysis that I've just shown you. Here's some of what we found. So again, K is number of studies, and N is number of people. So you can see there's a lot more studies and people. Very strong associations between materialism and compulsive buying, the feeling that I've just got to have that and I can't control myself. Materialism is possibly associated with more health risk behaviors like smoking, cigarettes, drinking alcohol, with more of a negative self-image, sort of self-doubt. Materialism is associated with lower levels of positive emotions throughout one's experience and lower overall subjective well-being, more depression, more anxiety, fewer positive statements about oneself, i.e. lower self-esteem, other kinds of disorders that are in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, lower physical health, i.e. more headaches, stomach aches, more experience of unpleasant emotions like anger and anxiety, and overall low life satisfaction. So not everybody's good and depressed. So for the last 10 years or so, as these data have accumulated, I've become increasingly interested in, well, what do we do about this? If materialism is a problem for people's well-being and for their social behavior and for the earth, what are some solutions that are possible? And I've come up with what I think is an elegant two-step solution. The first is you figure out what the causes of materialism are, and you eliminate those. The second, perhaps less obvious, is that you understand what the healthy values are, and you encourage those so that they become a larger slice of the value pie. And as that occurs, the slice of the value pie that is devoted to materialism will shrink. So what do we know about the causes of materialism? Well, one set of body of literature on the causes of materialism points out a pretty obvious cause of materialism, which is social modeling. Okay? So we know from the research that the more that people are exposed to messages which suggest that money, image, and power and status are important, the more they'll take on those messages too. So studies have shown that the more your parents care about materialistic values, the more the children will. The more your friends do, the more you will. If you watch more television, then you're likely to ingest more advertising messages. That's associated with higher levels of materialism. We also know that living in a highly neoliberal capitalist country like the United States and the United Kingdom and Australia, actually, compared to more coordinated strategic forms of capitalism like are found in Scandinavia, that former kind of Anglo capitalism is associated with higher levels of materialism too. Two studies have demonstrated that empirically. The less obvious cause of materialism that has also been well researched has to do with psychological threat and insecurity. So there's been numerous studies now which have shown that to the extent people either grew up in experiences which are likely to make them feel psychologically insecure or momentarily experience threats, then that tends to increase their materialism. So we know that growing up in a situation where your mother is kind of more cold and controlling instead of warm and nurturing predicts higher levels of materialism. Experiencing divorce when you were a child, which is a big insecurity for most kids, leads to higher levels of materialism. We know that experiencing poverty is associated with higher levels of materialism. And we know that if you bring people into the lab and you make them think about things like poverty or think about somebody who judges them or think about their own death, any of those kinds of things also tend to increase materialism, at least in the short term. Now, what do we know about healthy values? Well, Fred Grisey and I did a study some years ago where we gave people this goals list. We gave them a long list of goals, 11 different kinds of goals, each of which were measured with many items, and we asked them to rate how important each of these were. These subjects for the study were 1,800 college students from 15 nations. One of those nations, again, was Australia, actually. And what we did in this study was something different. We used a statistical technique that's called circular stochastic modeling. Now, what CSM does is it arranges people's values along the circumference of a circle. And it does it in the following way. It puts values which people experience as psychologically consistent with each other next to each other on the circle. And it puts values which are on the opposite, which are in psychological conflict with each other on opposite sides of the circle. So I'm going to show you the results of the CSM here momentarily. I'm going to say two things before I show it to you. First, there's a fair bit of information on here, so I'd encourage you to just focus on what I point out, otherwise it's easy to get overwhelmed. The second is I want to emphasize this isn't just something I came up with while sitting at my desk, okay? This is based on all of this data we collected, and it's been replicated in other kinds of ways. So here's the circumplex. Let me start by showing you the circles in the red, or the values that are in the red line. So these are what we called in this paper extrinsic values. We use that oftentimes synonymously with materialistic values. And what you can see is that popularity, image, and financial success cluster together here in the southwest quadrant of this circumplex. Now what this means is that to the extent somebody says image is kind of important to them, they're also likely to say popularity and financial success are important to them. That makes sense if you think about it, because almost always, why do we want to have a particular image? Well, so we can be popular and people think we're cool and like us. And how do we show that image? Well, usually it's through stuff we have to buy, and in order to buy that stuff, we have to be at least somewhat financially successful. I'm going to hold off on questions for right now, and we'll have time at the end, okay? So on the other side of the circumplex, we have what are called the intrinsic values. Now, we call these the intrinsic values because from our theoretical perspective, they're intrinsically satisfying to pursue because they do a relatively good job of meeting people's psychological needs. Now, the three main intrinsic values which we've studied over the years are for self-acceptance or personal growth, affiliation, which is like having close relationships with your family and friends, and community feeling, which is about trying to help the broader world. Now, one of the things I want to note in this circumplex, so who remembers how many degrees there are in a circle? Do you know? Yeah, how many? How many?
360.
Very good. So if two values were in perfect opposition to each other, how many degrees would they be different?
80. No, 180.
180. Very good. Financial success and community feeling were 193 degrees opposed in the CSM analyses. It's very difficult to simultaneously be greedy and generous. Okay? It's difficult to simultaneously do those two things, and that's what this represents. Good work. I'll tell your math teacher for you if you want. Now, there's another set of things we know about intrinsic values. Not only do they stand in opposition to the extrinsic materialistic values, but the more that people endorse intrinsic values, the lower their ecological footprint, the more sustainably they behave in those forest management games, the more they emit environmentally friendly behaviors, the more they engage in pro-social behaviors, the more cooperative and empathic they are, and the happier they are. So it's actually very simple. The same values that stand in opposition to materialism are the same values that make people happy, are the same values that contribute to civil society, are the same values which contribute to a sustainable world. So having this twofold strategy has led me to talk about a couple dozen, probably, different ways that you can apply this strategy to try to change your own personal life or society writ large as a way to diminish the negative influence of materialism in the world. I don't have time to talk about all of those tonight, obviously, so what I'm going to do is to talk about some at the personal level, some about some environmental communications work, and then one thing at the policy level with some other ideas. So let's talk at the personal level first off. So one of the things that has been very interesting to me at the personal change level has to do with the idea of voluntary simplicity. So voluntary simplicity is actually an idea that's been around for thousands of years. Many people have made choices to bag out of the work, spend, go into debt, so I have to work some more kind of lifestyle, and instead choose to live a life which is simpler. So they choose voluntarily to live a materially more simple life. Now, Dwayne Elgin was the person who really kind of coined this term in terms of it becoming popular, and what he said was that these are individuals who have chosen to pursue an inwardly rich lifestyle, which is focused on personal growth, family, volunteer activity, and ecology. Now, when I first heard about voluntary simplicity, I said, whoa, that's a rejection of materialistic values and an endorsement of intrinsic values. I hope everybody can see that, okay? So what Kirk Brown and I did was to get a sample of 200 self-identified voluntary simplifiers and then another sample of 200 mainstream Americans. And we matched those mainstream Americans to the VSers on their age, on their gender, and on their zip code, their geographical area. Now, we found several interesting things. I'm just going to tell you a couple of them here. The first thing we found was that compared to the mainstream Americans, the voluntary simplifiers were significantly happier. They were more satisfied with their lives. They were having more positive emotions in their lives and fewer negative emotions in their lives. Further, they were living in an ecologically more sustainable way. While they did not have anything near a sustainable ecological footprint, it was significantly lower than mainstream Americans. What we did next was to use structural equation modeling, which is another fancy statistical technique, to see what the role of people's intrinsic and extrinsic values were in these relationships. And what we found was that the voluntary simplifiers had much more intrinsic values and much less extrinsic values than mainstream Americans. And this completely explained why the voluntary simplifiers were happier, okay? The reason that the voluntary simplifiers were happier was because they had a different value orientation than mainstream Americans. It also explained partly why the voluntary simplifiers had lower ecological footprints, but it didn't fully explain that. There were other features that we didn't measure, we don't know what they are, but there were other features which also explained why voluntary simplifiers were living more lightly on the earth. So what does this mean in your own personal life? Well, if you're a counselor or a teacher, you can explore with people or with your husband and wife what your ideas are about happiness, okay, and what it is that brings about happiness. And are you living a life that's in concert with your values, with your intrinsic values? And then you can look into the ideas about voluntary simplicity. There's plenty of work out there in order to help you live a more simple life. Another thing I would have to say that's very important to do is that debt is the enemy of living a voluntarily simple life. And my experience as a professor and working with a lot of 18 to 22-year-olds is that many of them don't have the slightest idea what they're getting themselves into with regard to debt. And they don't even understand about how debt multiplies and all of that. I think that as all the adults out there, we have a responsibility in order to educate people about debt so they maybe have a choice to pursue this kind of lifestyle if they want. And two of the most established voluntary simplicity programs which have been used, Your Money or Your Life, it's been translated into something like 18 languages. It's essentially a 6 or 8 step program for living a more simple life. And then simplicity circles are basically support groups for people who get together once a week and talk about how to live more simply. Now, if you don't like voluntary simplicity as a person-level intervention, some other things that have been done that have been shown to decrease materialism. We just published a paper last month, or earlier this year actually, that showed that a 6-hour intervention with adolescents and their parents about financial literacy had an effect on decreasing the children's materialism, and that effect was still there 9 months after the program ended. Another study showed that in contrast to momentarily thinking about your own death, if we did a study once where we had people think either about dental pain every day for 6 days or their own death every day for 6 days. We chose dental pain because it's unpleasant but not fatal, but death obviously is fatal and unpleasant. What we found, and what others have found, is that being forced to think about your own death seems to shift people's value systems towards intrinsic values and away from materialism. I think that there's something about realizing that you're only going to be here in the world for so long that helps people intuitively know what it is that's better for them and orient in that way. We've also found that the practice of mindfulness meditation can increase the likelihood that people orient towards intrinsic and away from extrinsic values. Now, a second way in which we've been applying this work, which I think Mark will talk about a little bit later, has to do with environmental communication. So one of the things that, I'm a professor. I was saying at lunch today, I've been in kindergarten. I've been in school since kindergarten. I've never been out in the regular world. But one of the things that I've recognized in talking with environmentalists is that lots of times they make appeals on the basis of what we would consider extrinsic values. This will save you money, you'll look cool, there's a business case for sustainability, green consumerism, etc. From our perspective, the danger of this approach is that essentially what you're doing is you're encouraging the very values which I showed you earlier in the talk are associated with worse ecological behavior. Okay? So to the extent that environmentalists make appeals on the basis of extrinsic values, from our research suggests that that actually will undermine in the long term their interests. And there is evidence to show this. I'm just going to show you a little bit of it, that it's better to actually activate and encourage intrinsic values. So this was a study I did with Ken Sheldon, who you can see is one of my collaborators here and I've talked about earlier in the talk. What we did in this study was we brought students at the University of Missouri into the lab, and they were in one of 5 conditions. They either had to write about what it was like to be a human, what it was like to be a University of Missouri student, what it was like to be an American, and then we had 2 more conditions. In one condition, they had to write about what it was like to be an American, but we reminded them that America is the place where you can come and make a lot of money and go to Hollywood and become famous. Or we reminded them that America is a place where personal freedom is really valued, as are family values, and that America has a long history of helping others. I want to note, we never mentioned the environment. Then what we did was we asked all of the subjects to pretend that they were consultants to the federal government and that they were going to make recommendations as to what the average American's ecological footprint should be 5 years from now. So we said, how much meat should the average American eat? How big should the average American's house be? How much miles per gallon should the average car get? And here's what we found, is that the most sustainable recommendations for ecological footprints were given by people who had had the intrinsic American identity activated. We never had even mentioned the environment. But by thinking about intrinsic values, what happened was there's what we call a bleed over effect, such that all of those values and the relevant attitudes and behaviors had gotten activated in the person's mind. And furthermore, the values which stood in opposition to intrinsic values, those materialistic ones, got suppressed. And as a result, these individuals ended up making more sustainable recommendations. I want to note with much chagrin that the highest recommendations, the worst recommendations, were actually given by the group who just thought about being American. Now, one of the arguments that my colleagues and I in this work have been having with a variety of different individuals who work for ecological organizations has to do with whether or not our approach works for people who are hardcore materialists. So there are a variety of consulting agencies out there that say, look, if you're trying to change the ecological behavior of somebody who really cares about materialistic extrinsic values, appealing to their intrinsic values won't work. Now, they claim that they have data to support their viewpoint, but those data are proprietary and they've never let us look at them. So therefore, we had to do our own study. So what we did was we screened over 700 adults in the UK, and we chose the 30 most extrinsically oriented folks we could get. The people scoring at the very highest level in how much they valued power, money, status, achievement, all the rest. And these were the people who were in the whole rest of the study, just these really extrinsic people, okay? And they came into the lab, and we primed them with either materialistic values about popularity, image, and wealth, or they had to write about intrinsic values. I want to note, with those intrinsic values, we didn't even mention the environment, as you can see. Then what we did was everybody underwent a standardized interview about 4 topics, 2 of which were ecological, 2 of which had to do with social development, and then they had to do either with local things or worldwide things. And a linguist coded these interviews. The linguist didn't know anything about the study. He didn't know who the people were. He didn't know that we had primed people. He didn't know what we primed them with. We just said, read these studies. What do you see? Well, one of the things he coded for was whether somebody should do something about the problem or not. Whether or not the subject was saying, yeah, this is a problem. Somebody should do something about that. The extrinsically oriented people who had been primed with intrinsic values were significantly more likely to say that someone should do something about these problems as opposed to nobody should do anything. Furthermore, they were more likely to say, you know, this is a problem because it's a problem for these people, not because it's a problem for me. I'm going to give you 2 quotes of equally extrinsically oriented people who've been primed differently, just to kind of bring this to life. So this is an extrinsically oriented person who's been primed with extrinsic materialistic values, and he's talking about what would motivate him to engage in better ecological behavior. What would motivate me? I suppose money, if there was a financial incentive to be more proactive. I do tend to switch things off, but that's more a case of me saving money and electricity than thinking, oh, that's going to help the world. Now here's an equally materialistic individual who's been primed with intrinsic values. I do think that the earth and the environment is precious and valuable. I think it should be at the top of the political agenda. I think that the world that we pass on to the next generation, you know, is our responsibility. It's hard for the person to get it out, okay? But by having activated those intrinsic values, those bleed over into the person's expressed attitudes about the environment, even though the person is very materialistic. So in sum, when our approach, which was called the common cause approach, argues that when you're trying to motivate either yourself or others, it's much more helpful both usually in the short term and definitely in the long term to make appeals to intrinsic values than to materialistic values. If you're interested in more of that work, here's a website where you can download all kinds of useful information. The last thing that I'll talk about tonight has to do with policy. There's lots of policy directions we could go, but advertising is one of the big ones. How many of you have heard of Channel 1? Okay, so what Channel 1 is it's a business, sorry Perth and Adelaide, it's a business in the United States that makes its money in the following way. What it does is it goes into school districts, primarily poor school districts, and it gives them a free television for every classroom. In return, what the school district has to do is to show the Channel 1 news broadcast, which is about 10 or 12 minutes long, every three or 4 times a week. Embedded in the Channel 1 newscast are 3 or 4 minutes of advertising. So what Channel 1 does is it uses the United States mandatory school laws in order to deliver advertising messages to children in a situation that they cannot escape. Brandon Greenberg did a study where they matched kids in Channel 1 school districts with tightly matched kids in non-Channel 1 school districts and found that the former were more materialistic and consumer-oriented than the latter. Another study that we published last year is published with Jean Twenge. Remember that line that I showed you at the beginning of the talk that showed that youth's materialism has gone up from the 1960s to today? Well, there's similar findings that you can look at if you survey high school seniors instead of incoming college freshmen, not surprising. What Jean and I did was we took how materialistic youth were in each year, and we also got a measure of how much of the United States overall GNP was due to advertising and marketing in that year. And we found that as the extent of marketing has become a larger part of the overall U.S. economy, children's materialism has gone up. Furthermore, Jennifer Good did a study with structural equation modeling where she studied people's TV use, found that it was associated with higher levels of materialism and thus with worse environmental attitudes. And that same path model has been replicated by others in the US and the UK, showing TV leads to materialism, leads to lower well-being among children. So what are some directions forward? Well, it seems to me that here in Australia, you don't have too much advertising in schools yet, but I've also had Australians say to me that what happens in the United States sometimes comes to Australia 5 or 10 years later. So I would encourage you to be careful about the possibility of ads in schools. It's not just on report cards and Channel 1s. There's a company, Bus Radio, trying to put radio programs onto school buses. We've had advertising in product placement in textbooks, count with M&Ms. Certainly you do have advertising in many public places, and that exposes both children and adults to advertisements. My understanding is that the tax laws in the Australia government are the same as in the U.S., whereby any money that a business spends on advertising and marketing expenses is actually a tax write-off. Now imagine, if you will, that all of those billions of dollars spent on advertising every year was taxed at 15 or 20%. I call it a value pollution tax. And that the money from that tax was used in order to build green spaces, provide better education for children, and develop programs in order to support financial literacy and intrinsic values. Finally, I would note that one could work to ban advertising to children. Some Scandinavian nations have banned advertising to children for quite a while. And there was great news in Brazil just a few months ago where they banned advertising to children, calling it abusive and therefore illegal. Now there's going to be a great opportunity in the coming weeks for this potentially to be discussed around the world, because the Special Rapporteur to the United Nations on cultural rights is going to make a record, scheduled to make a report in which she will recommend banning all commercial advertising and marketing in public and private schools and prohibiting all forms of advertising to children under 12. Now this will just be a recommendation, but it is a recommendation that could be discussed in many countries around the world, including Australia. Don't say never. Some other policy directions that one could pursue that I don't have time to talk about tonight. Right now, GNP completely privileges materialistic values. There are many different alternative indicators which have been developed. The Australian Unity Wellbeing Index is one, to incorporate in what I consider intrinsic values into them. It can also be done at the local level, not just at the federal. Can support alternative business models. At present, when a corporation incorporates, it basically has to focus on maximizing profit for shareholders and nothing else. But there's this cool new form of corporation that's called a B Corp or a benefit corp. How many of you ever heard of a benefit corp? Yeah, this is going to be my new question, I think. What a benefit corp is when it incorporates, it says, we will balance maximizing shareholder profit with the good of the community. And therefore, the board and the CEO and all of the shareholders know that they won't always try to maximize profit. They'll also consider the intrinsic value of community as they make business decisions. Cooperatives have for hundreds of years been doing the same thing. Someday check out the website of, it's something like the International Association of Cooperatives. Look at their guiding principles. You'll see it's all intrinsic values from my perspective. Promoting time affluence is another great way going forward. Right now we live in a society that focuses on material affluence. Time affluence would be another great way to go forward. I understand that your current Prime Minister made a proposal not too long ago to extend family leave substantially. I think that's a great reflection of intrinsic values. Whether or not that's why he did it or not, I have no idea. Nonetheless, it is a policy which, if you're making a policy that gives families more flexibility to be with their family and not have to work, that is a move towards intrinsic values. In sum, I hope that you see that materialistic values have been scientifically shown to be negatively associated with ecological, personal, and social well-being. I've given you some examples of changes you could make in your own personal lifestyle. I've shown how communicators can work differently, and I've suggested some different policy changes. I'd encourage you to keep this basic strategy in mind as you go forth, and I thank you for your attention. And I understand we'll do Q&A after the next two presentations.
Thank you, Tim.
You bet. Do you want me to take that down for you?
That's all right. I'll take care of that. All right. I'm going to be pretty quick because I think my messages are very similar to Tim's. I'm coming at it from a slightly different perspective in terms of a different research framework, which is called social practice theory. So Tim's talked a lot about the basis of materialism and values, extrinsic and intrinsic values. I'm focusing in on a particular social practice, the practice of shopping that we all engage in all the time. And here's some particularly impressive shopping going on in the, I think it's Boxing Day, possibly in Canada that's happening, but you see the same kind of thing obviously in Australia. So our this week the WWF's Living Planet report came out, or last week for 2014, and what it's telling us, we heard about ecological footprint before, is that we currently need 1.5 Earths to sustain the level of consumption that we have on the planet. And of course we don't have an extra half a planet, so we're in trouble. Australia's got the 13th highest ecological footprint per person, so we're right up there on the list. A little bit behind the US and Canada, and we've actually improved since the last report. We were 8th, so a little bit of cause for hope there, but we're still in some pretty deep trouble here. So where is that footprint coming from? This is some work done a few years ago now for the Australian Conservation Foundation, looking at the typical consumption-based footprint, ecological footprint of an average Australian household. And what it shows you very quickly is that we focus a lot of our attention on our energy use and on our transport use, but this chart is showing that actually it's our food choices and our shopping, the goods and services we buy, that make up a huge proportion of our ecological footprint, or the footprint that we're ultimately responsible for, because this is going right down the chain, in this case using input-output analysis. So some 84% of our ecological impact happens when we're out shopping for food and other goods and services. So that's why I think it's important to focus in on that practice of shopping and start to think, well, what would sustainable shopping look like? And is it about our individual choices? Is it about us making better choices to say, when I'm in the supermarket, I should buy the Fair Trade or the Rainforest Alliance option? Is it that simple, or is it unfair to put all the emphasis on individuals? Is there more going on here and other ways to think about this? And that led me to work with social practice theory, which really tries to take the emphasis off the individual and the more traditional sort of give an individual more information, try and change their behaviour approach, to think about the practices that people are embedded in, the social norms and cultural norms that they're exposed to, the infrastructures and material situations that they find themselves in, the histories of how shopping practices have developed, the contexts that shape or constrain or facilitate particular shopping choices. And social practice theory also asks us to think about everyday practices that might be inconspicuous, because it's those everyday practices that are actually delivering the unsustainable outcomes that we see. It's the shopping that we don't think about, that's become habitual, that we never actually hold up to the light and say, what am I actually doing here? Is this working for me? So social practice theory encourages us to think about those everyday practices and what they mean for us. And social practice theory says that a practice is made up of 3 elements: meanings and values, which Tim has talked about a lot tonight, but also the skills and know-how that we bring into our social situations, and third, the materials and infrastructure that makes up a practice. So it's worth giving an example of that to make it a bit more tangible, and I'll use the example of driving, which is something that most people are very familiar with. So if you think about driving as a social practice and how it integrates material, skills and meaning, If you think about the materials that are involved in driving, you can't do driving unless you've got a car, obviously, but also a whole infrastructure of roads, petrol stations, repair shops, street signs and maps, GPS apps to help you find your way around, motor registries and everything that goes with those, garages and carports, parking areas, a license to say you're allowed to do this. So all of that material is wrapped up in this practice, and it starts to shape what actually happens. And if those materials change, then the practice starts to change, and it might change in ways that have different ecological and social impacts. What sort of skills do you need? Well, obviously you need to know how to drive, how to drive a manual or an automatic car, how to drive in different conditions, whether it's driving at night or in the rain. And it's not just the information in your head of how to do this, but really practical know-how, practical experience and competence in doing these things. So it's not enough to just know how to drive in the rain. You have to have actually done it to incorporate it into your practice as part of what you do. And then the third element in our practice of driving is the meanings that we bring to it. So every social practice has particular meanings that are generated within the practice, particular meanings that people bring to it that are an integral part of that practice. There might be things like road rules and conventions that we follow when we drive, but also the ideas of when I get in the car, it's a sense of freedom, or I'm getting out on the open road. When I get my license, it's a coming of age. The experiences of road rage or emotional responses to traffic, usually negative. And then is driving for different people just a means to an end, a way to get somewhere, or an end in itself that people love to drive? So people bring different meanings, and their practices start to look different depending on what meanings they bring. So we can apply this kind of approach to look at shopping as a social practice. And of course there's no one social practice of shopping. Shopping for clothes looks different to shopping for appliances, looks different to shopping for groceries, but there's common elements, and it's just a different way to look at the practice of shopping and start to see if it generates different insights. So if we think first about materials, we can start to notice things like, firstly, you need a particular kind of material called money to be able to access shopping, and the more of that material you have, the wider range of material products you can actually access through your shopping. We start to look at the structure of our cities. So the urban form of cities encourages car-based shopping, for example. It encourages you to drive to big central supermarkets and do your shopping there instead of walking to the local store. The design of shopping centres, when we get into them, channels us towards particular choices, towards particular products. People who design shopping centres know where to put things so that you will be guided towards particular choices. So all of these material aspects are starting to shape what you actually do in ways that are often very unconscious, and we need to be more conscious about them. We can think about packaging, which predominantly is used to attract us and get us to buy something, rather than thinking about the material that will have the least impact as packaging. We can think about what information we have on the products that we buy, and that there's often a lack of information at the point of sale to really help us make good decisions when we're there. We can think about the rise of online infrastructure and smartphones and how that is supporting new shopping practices, leading more people to shop online. And of course we can think about the vast amount of material that's out there, the duplication of products that could be shared. You think of a drill that, everybody's got a drill in their garage, it gets used a few minutes in its lifetime. Wouldn't it be better to share those on a neighbourhood scale?
Homer Simpson's got the right idea then.
Homer Simpson?
Yeah, he was always borrowing debts.
There you go. Part of the sharing economy.
Yeah.
Simpsons had it right. So we can talk about the skills that make up part of the social practice of shopping. What are some of the skills we need to shop? Well, we need to be able to interpret complex labels, research alternative product choices, compare prices. Those are, seem fairly straightforward, but not everyone has the same literacy in all of those kinds of things, and that leads to different engagement in practices. You need to be able to negotiate conversations with sales staff. Well, of course, they're trying to exercise their own skills in selling you particular options, and if they're trying to guide people towards less sustainable options, then unless you're able to resist that conversation, it's going to be harder for you to make those choices. Knowing how to use what you're going to buy properly might limit your choices as well. Maybe there's particular items that you don't know how to use, so you steer away from them, even though they might be more sustainable. Tim's talked a lot about advertising and resisting advertising. Seeing through it is, of course, a skill that can be useful in shopping as a social practice. And working to provide money so that you can go shopping is obviously a skill that's needed for the way that we shop at the moment. And then finally, the meanings. Again, Tim's talked a lot about advertising. It creates social demand, reinforces particular values. More is better. Buy this to be popular. Buying will make you happy. Keeping up with the Joneses. So Tim's covered that pretty well already. A lot of the choices we make are not rational, weighing it up right now, thinking about the best choice for me choices, but they're habitual purchases. They might have been handed down by our families because they bought a particular product. We're used to it. We just keep buying it. We don't think about the impacts of it. We look for convenience in our busy lives increasingly, so we've seen a rise of online shopping related to that. Sustainable products might be perceived as harder work or less reliable, so we steer away from them. We've talked already about things like the hedonic treadmill, the idea that more consumption doesn't buy happiness. But we do compare ourselves against the people around us, and so we try and consume more and more to keep up with them. We can talk about things like single action bias, where people feel like once they've taken one action to improve their ecological impact, reduce their footprint, that they've done their bit. So you might go and buy a particular eco product and then you stop. You've done what you need to do. So I'm going to close with just 6 suggestions that come out of this social practice thinking for things we can do to start confronting our practice of shopping and maybe start moving it in a different direction. Some of them are very much along the same lines as Tim, and we didn't consult beforehand, so maybe that's good. We're triangulating here. But responsible advertising, and this is something that's the common cause approach that Tim has talked about and that Mark will talk about more, has been looking at in a particular report called Think of Me as Evil, which is a great read. But having less pervasive advertising that affirms intrinsic values, not advertising to children, building skills in being able to resist or see through advertising, to see through the manipulation that's happening in advertising. All of these things I think are important. I'm really encouraged by the emerging sharing paradigm, the many initiatives that are popping up that are about sharing goods rather than owning them. That can mean less material consumption. We're not buying as many things. We're sharing cars, we're sharing bikes, we're sharing drills. Also cooperatives and local food movements, shared working hubs. All of these seem to be part of a new, less materialistic paradigm that is starting to emerge. Now, whether that will continue, there's certainly resistance to it from incumbent interests, is something to watch. But we can all engage in this and support it. Improved information at the point of sale I think is important so that you can make better decisions when you're shopping. Smartphone apps haven't got to the stage where you can do something like this and be told what's the most ecological option for me just by looking at the shelf, but it can't be that far away. And one of the problems I think is also there's so many different labelling schemes that it's paralysing. How do you know which one to choose? Is it Rainforest Alliance or Fair Trade? Which is better? And you don't know where to go. So simplifying, consolidating those labelling schemes, but also broadening what they consider so that they give a better overall idea of what's the best choice for the planet and for the people on it is important. I think retailers need to start taking some responsibility, and around the world we've seen the rise of divestment movements, trying to get companies, organisations to get out of fossil fuels, which is a great thing. I think that idea can be extended to retailers and starting to talk to them about not stocking unethical products, moving away from products that don't have a good impact on the planet. So we can start to put pressure on retailers to go down that path as well. And of course have sustainability programs for retail sales staff so that they can do a better job in trying to sell the better products. Working less has already come up. Juliet Shaw's done a lot of work on this in America, and there's a pretty simple equation here. You earn less, you spend less, you emit and degrade less. So that's a way to bring back some leisure time and to spend it on things that are better aligned with intrinsic values. And finally, to seek genuine well-being. And I love this photo of a Bhutanese lady. I love their indicator of what they're aiming for in Bhutan, which is gross national happiness. And I think this image illustrates gross national happiness. This is what genuine well-being feels like. So if we're moving away from measures like GMP and GDP, we need to start having a conversation about what it is that truly delivers well-being and how we might start to measure that as a society instead of measuring things like endless GDP growth. And of course, there are little initiatives like this one, Buy Nothing Day, which happens every year just after Thanksgiving, where we can feel part of a wider movement that is doing something to resist shopping and consumerism. So I'll leave it there. Thank you. Which leaves us with one more speaker, which is Mark Chenery. So Mark is a co-founder of Common Cause Australia and passionate about values-based community engagement. He worked in advertising before becoming a journalist, reporting on the advertising, marketing and media industry as features editor of Ad News magazine. Growing increasingly concerned with the negative impacts of advertising on society, Mark transitioned into the non-profit world, working for Auscare and later initiating and leading ActionAid Australia's strategic work on values and frames. Over to you, Mark.
Cheers.
I'll get this set up for you.
Yeah, I won't take up much time. I think we should get to Q&As as soon as possible, but I wanted to quickly tell you about my story around realising the importance of values and what a group of people in Australia are actually doing about it. So, like Chris said, I started off my career in advertising, working first for an online advertising agency and then working as a journalist reporting on the advertising, marketing and media industry in Australia. And I left advertising because of my values. I simply couldn't bear spending any of my time talking to people about how to sell people stuff they didn't need, to impress people they didn't like, to paraphrase Fight Club. So about 6 years ago, I turned down a promotion and about half my salary to join the non-profit world, working in communications and community engagement for an organisation called ActionAid. And ActionAid works with partners in over 45 countries around the world, essentially empowering women to stand up for their own human rights. And my life, needless to say, felt a lot more meaningful. But after a while of working in the non-profit sector, I did realise that despite the amazing work that many non-profit organisations do, and they do amazing work, the way a lot of us engage with the public in our work isn't actually always in line with our values and ultimately could be undermining our long-term missions. So that's where Common Cause comes in, and Tim has spoken a little bit about Common Cause tonight. But Common Cause essentially is an approach to engaging with the public which is based on an understanding of what genuinely motivates human goals, attitudes and behaviours, and it's essentially everything that Tim's already spoken to us about, values. So Common Cause started in the UK in 2010, so it's 4 years old, but it's rapidly spreading around the world. I co-founded Common Cause in Australia with Angela Rudder, who's in the audience tonight, as well as Adam Macher from the Australian Conservation Foundation. In 2012, after reading the original Common Cause report, in which a lot of Tim Kasser's work is actually cited. And in March this year, I actually left ActionAid to focus on Common Cause. Because even though global poverty is the issue that I care about more than anything else, I know that the only way that we're actually going to end poverty is by addressing the underlying structural causes. And the only way we're going to address the underlying structural causes of poverty is by building a critical mass of people who are willing to challenge our economic and our political structures. And of course, the only way we're going to be able to build that sort of mass support is by actually shifting values, shifting cultural values. Because values have an impact on more than just our life satisfaction and our well-being, and Tim's book, The High Price of Materialism, is absolutely brilliant, and even for me, who've been working on values for a while, was quite a good self-reflection on my life and how I could balance my life out more. The values also connect to, as Tim has alluded to and spoken to a little bit about pro-social and pro-environmental attitudes and behaviours. Tim's spoken about a few studies, but I'll mention a few more. there have been studies that show a positive correlation between intrinsic values and our attitudes towards global poverty, our support for environmental policies, as Tim spoke about, our attitudes towards human rights and towards immigration, which is obviously an important issue in Australia. But more importantly, especially for people who are interested in actually changing the world, not just talking about it, there are lots of studies that show positive correlations between intrinsic values and our actual behaviour, including greater levels of political activism, people more consistently buying ethical products, people being more likely to recycle, conserve electricity and, like Tim said, reduce their ecological footprints, and spending more time volunteering to help others. But unfortunately, when you look at the work of non-profit organisations through the lens of values, whether it be the aid and development sector or the environmental movement, you realise that much of our public engagement is at best ineffective at achieving our missions and at worst actually counterproductive. And Tim has actually already spoken a little bit about this in the environmental context. But the reason this is because we're increasingly using extrinsic values in the way that we engage the public. And that in turn is weakening the intrinsic values the research tells us is actually necessary for our organisations to achieve our missions. So one way in which this is happening, a reason for this, and Tim spoke about consulting firms, we are increasingly segmenting our audiences based on their values. And at first glance that might look like a good thing, but the implications aren't always good. For example, environmental organisations encouraging people to install solar panels on their roofs because it'll save them money, as opposed to appealing to people's intrinsic values around protecting the environment. And this sort of value segmentation, of course, ignores the fact that we all have all the values. We all have both extrinsic and intrinsic values. And when NGOs start appealing to extrinsic values to encourage people to engage in intrinsic activities, if you like, that is strengthening those extrinsic values over time. And it's not just a problem in the environmental movement. I'm sad to say that over the past few years, aid and development organisations have increasingly been using extrinsic values to justify, for example, the foreign aid budget. And we've done this in several ways. Firstly, by pointing out that aid is good for business, by opening up and growing new markets in our region. Secondly, that aid will help prevent terrorism in Australia, for example, by funding moderate Islamic schools in Indonesia. And finally, that aid will stop the boats by providing people with more opportunities at home so they don't need to come here in the first place. Now, of course, aid does all of these things, and they're actually all important. But what's happening from a values perspective is that NGOs are justifying aid based on extrinsic values around wealth and security, instead of intrinsic values like equality and social justice, our actual honest drivers. And apart from the serious negative side effect on values of this approach, it's actually not that effective. Since the sector started to use this sort of messaging, and it is something that we do discuss internally, so it's a very intentional practice, we've gone from bipartisan support for increasing the aid budget to billions of dollars being cut from the aid budget repeatedly by both Labor and Liberal governments. And now there is a sizable section, I think it might be 50% of Greens supporters, actually support cutting foreign aid. Obviously, aid isn't the solution to poverty, and I don't think it is, but I think it is a bit of a barometer for how we are encouraging people to care about our issues. But in short, betraying our values isn't actually particularly effective, so what can be done about it? Well, first and foremost, NGOs actually need to understand or realise the importance of values. Many non-profit organisations simply are unaware of this sort of research that we've been talking about tonight, and certainly not understanding their role in actually shaping values in Australia. So for that reason, one of the key purposes of Common Cause is actually to raise awareness of this important body of research with non-profit organisation staff. So while Tim's in Australia, for example, we're running workshops on applying Common Cause principles in practice with staff and campaigners from environmental organisations, domestic social services organisations, aid and development organisations in Melbourne, Sydney, Canberra and Perth. And actually we have a workshop on tomorrow that we still have some seats available for if you're interested, which will be here at UTS. If you're interested, let me know. But we're also planning on running more, so we'll run some more in Sydney and Melbourne next year, and hopefully also some in Perth as well as moving into Adelaide. Because we're seeing a lot of strong interest from those areas, but anywhere we see interest we'll be happy to talk to people. And secondly, we're working with those organisations that are very interested in Common Cause to actually start to implement a values-based approach to their work. So ActionAid Australia, for example, has added a whole mission objective to its 5-year strategy on how to shift values in Australia. And thirdly, and very importantly, we're working to bridge the gap between academics and practitioners by linking the two where possible. So, for example, we're working with the University of Adelaide on a research project to investigate the spillover effects on values of people installing solar panels on their roofs. And finally, probably most importantly, I think from a how do we get non-profits to work differently, we're working to build a coalition of NGOs and academics who want to go beyond specific issues, so aid, poverty, the environment, and start exploring campaigns and policies and initiatives that would have a greater impact on strengthening intrinsic values in Australia. So, for example, and I swear this is not an example that I coordinated with Tim and Chris, but how powerful would it be, for example, if we did get a coalition of NGOs from the environmental movement, the aid and development sector and social services domestically to come together with academia to campaign for limits to advertising to children, specifically because of the values impact that has on our society. So if you're interested in Common Cause, if the sort of stuff that Tim has been talking about has made you want to do something about it, I do encourage you to get involved with Common Cause. It's a growing group of people in Australia. You can visit our website, commoncause.org.au. There you can join our email list, find out about sort of workshops and events that we have. You can also join our Facebook group and join the conversation. Yes, or you can, valuesandframes.org is also a brilliant resource for a lot of the reports that have been published over the last few years. And finally, just a quick plug that on the 22nd of, if tomorrow is not convenient for you, we'll be conducting a workshop in Sydney as part of the Changemakers Festival. So that's on Wednesday the 22nd. So you can go to the Changemakers website to find our event listed there. So that's all for me.
All right, that means it's time for questions. We've got about half an hour left for questions and answers. I'll take a few here in Sydney to start with, and then I will go to our friends in Perth and Adelaide to collect some questions from them. I might have our panel grab themselves a chair and perch up the front here. Now you can either shout out your questions or you can use one of these mics. It might be better to use the mic that our friends elsewhere can hear. What's that?
Thank you very much. It was very interesting to listen to you three. Tim, I wanted to ask you a bit more about that process of priming intrinsic values, of helping people rediscover those values within them, and obviously you can do that in a short-term intervention sort of in the lab. But I'm interested in your thoughts about how does that work in real life in terms of getting people to draw on those values within?
Thank you. So priming, so first off I want to reiterate something that Mark alluded to, is that the viewpoint here, and there's good evidence to support it, is that all of us have all of those values, okay? You couldn't prime them and have them have effect if it wasn't there in the first place, okay? But I want to raise and emphasize that, because that is sometimes a leap of faith when interacting with certain individuals, right? Okay, and that's partly because of our own stereotypes of those individuals. That's partly because of the way those individuals have acted. But so far, the evidence seems to suggest, and I can give that maybe psychopaths don't have some community values, but that's a small percentage of the population. The idea here is that we're being primed all the time. Okay, so in the United States, some studies suggest we see about 3,000 commercial messages a day. So those would all be priming us momentarily. To the extent that a politician says something about economic growth, or a newscaster says something about how the stock market is doing, there's another prime. So as we walk through our day, we're being primed over and over. We're also having internal primes too. Okay, it's not always sort of an external thing in, but sometimes there's some memory that comes up, or some desire we have, which would also act to move us in one direction or another. So that's the sort of some background information. There have been some studies which have been done out in the quote-unquote real world that I can tell you about. One was done by Martin van Steenkies in Belgium. What he did in this study was he had Belgian education students, and excuse me, they were learning about recycling as part of what they were learning about anyway. And this was the extent of the manipulation for the crime. Half of the students were told that the reason that they should learn more about recycling was because it would save their school district money. And the other half were told the reason that they should learn about recycling was because it would be good for the community in which they taught. That was it. So it's about a 2-second manipulation. Martin studied these people over the next 2 weeks. 2 weeks later, he gave them a test on recycling. The people who had it framed in the intrinsic fashion did better on the test. He gave everyone in the class the opportunity to go on a field trip to a recycling center. The people who had it framed in an intrinsic fashion were more likely to go or to sign up to go. And he also put some reserves on, or some readings on reserve at the library, and he measured who actually went to the library and checked out the reserves. The people who had it framed in an intrinsic fashion were more likely to go to the library. From about a 2-second manipulation, he's got effects 2 weeks out. Now imagine what would happen if you continually were priming people of all the NGOs around, or when we go to the shop, we were seeing these messages, right? Then we would be receiving multiple other kinds of intrinsic messages out there in our real world, which also would influence us. One other study I'll just mention that's unpublished, but was presented at a study or a scientific conference. In this study, they actually got coffee shops, 2 privately owned coffee shops, even a university coffee shop, who had been trying to sell reusable mugs for a long time. They got them to either put intrinsic messages like, love the earth, buy this mug, or extrinsic messages like save cash, buy this mug on mugs. They had baseline of how many mugs had been sold, reusable mugs had been sold for the months before, and they found that once they began the implementation, twice as many mugs with the intrinsic were sold as with the extras. Okay? So what you can have is a variety of ways you can do these things out there in the real world that could potentially have these longer-term impacts. So those are just 2 examples of the kind of thing that I think happens. Next.
Are you able to pass the mic around yourself? So maybe just behind you next. Thank you.
And the screen doesn't copy up.
Yeah, saw that. Thank you.
Yeah, can I firstly thank all 3 of you for the great presentations and for the work that you're doing as well. And I agree wholeheartedly with the baseline message, except the one element in which you painted as a problem that was prepared in the 20th century. And I guess I can take you back to 399 BC when Socrates was before the Athenian parliament there, and he was saying, do not be concerned about your persons and your property, but pursue virtue. And he was summarily executed for corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods of the state. And 400 years later, Jesus of Nazareth, the same thing, advocating the same intrinsic virtues, also executed for perverting the nation. So is there something intrinsic in the state economic and political structures that needs to change, rather than just talking about adjustments? Is there something fundamentally that needs to change in terms of those structures?
Was that directed to me?
To you.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, I by no means meant to suggest that the problem of materialism only emerged in the 20th century. Actually, the opening quote for the high price of materialism is from Lao Tzu, which is about the same time as Socrates, actually. It's chase after money and security, and your heart will never unclench. Care about other people's approval, and you will be their prisoner. Do your work and move on. The only path is serenity. Okay? Something like that. So, this is something which I do think is very basic to human species. And so there has always been, the best I can tell, a tendency for people to have materialistic ambitions. And I think that's why the surplus works like it does. I think there's an evolution, probably an evolutionarily ingrained set of motives to focus on those extrinsic motives. I often say, you know, we're not very big as a species, we're not very fast, our senses aren't very good, but we're really good materialists, okay? And that's one of the things that I think helped us to survive as a species. And it's still there as a tendency in all of us. The fact that basically every wisdom and religious tradition warns against concern for materialism, Buddhism does, Islam does, the list goes on and on, suggests again that materialism has always been part of us, right? I think that the issue is that in most cultures beforehand, there were stronger countervailing forces which suggested that materialism should be kind of held in check to some extent. Whereas once the 20th century hit and neoliberal form of capitalism became more and more powerful and other kinds of traditions started to wane, you also have the fact that capitalism takes self-interest and raises it to the highest good. Okay? And then you have lots of new kinds of technology, etc. So I do think that there is something worse, if you will, about the 20th and 21st century societies and the ideologies of those economic systems. That said, you know, it wasn't until I think I was in my 30s that I realized that the purpose of the state, government of a state, is essentially to protect the property of those who have property. And if you take a look at the founding of my country, many people don't know this, but dollar for dollar, George Washington is the richest president that has ever been president in the United States. He was the richest man in the United States at the time the United States was founded. So, you know, there's long been traditions of governments being very invested in making sure people are materialistic, because after all, why do they want GDP to grow? Well, because that's what gives them tax revenue so that they can do the things they want, whether it's building schools and roads or going to war. So there's a very important reason for any government to try to maximize economic growth at pretty much any cost, and thus keeps people materialistic as much as possible. Do either of you have anything like that?
No, that was great.
I was wondering whether you could broaden the issue a little bit to the issue of climate change and sustainability, which is deeply impacted on by consumerism. And I suggest that the world is facing a crisis because of the inability of most populations to actually comprehend the threat that we're facing. And I was just wondering if this relates at all to the consumerism psychology, and whether what psychologists have done to try to understand the lack of human response to this threat.
Yeah, I'll say a little bit on that, because I think when you are very focused on your self-interest and on what's important to you, then with an issue like climate change, you're going to look at, well, is it going to impact me? You're very interested in those local impacts and what you're seeing that might threaten your self-interest. But climate change is so characterised by impacts that are distant in space and time, impacts on other people, that if you're not thinking through intrinsic framing, then it's not going to seem as important to you. Unless, you know, you get caught up in a bushfire or an event, a drought, something like we've had in Australia, that starts to make it feel like it might be real for you, and then you do connect that to climate change. So yes, people that are thinking of it through a self-interest frame might start to care about climate change if they can connect events that they've been through to it. And I've seen in workshops, community engagement workshops around climate change, particularly in rural areas where people have been through events like droughts and bushfires, that they often do really connect with climate change and see it as a local and important issue for them. But for others who haven't had those experiences, unless you're thinking globally, you're thinking about impacts in other countries, on other people, impacts on future generations, it just won't seem as important to you. So the more we can bring forth those intrinsic framings, I think the more that people can start to actually see climate change, and until people can really see it and feel that it might be important to people that they care about, they're going to be less inclined to act. I might go to Adelaide because they have had a question up for a little while. So,
And Chris, you should be one of them.
okay. So Adelaide, would you like to ask your question yourself rather than have me read it out? We should be able to hear you now, if you unmute yourself. Adelaide? Maybe I'll just read it out then.
Hi, Nadia. We're here.
Here we go. Do you want to read out your question, Adelaide?
Ooh, I'll do that. I just have to get it back again to read it out, or I will pre-see it. This is Nadia in Adelaide, and this has been fascinating, and all of us, I think, appreciate that values underlie most of what we do, our lifestyles, our behaviours, even our thoughts. I've been working with an organisation called Global Action Plan, which I helped found about 25 years ago, an international organisation that developed an approach to sustainable lifestyle change that wasn't based on values, because we didn't have an understanding of how we might actually change values at that time. So my question is really, since you've done so much on values, do you know how to change values? What we found was that we came in sideways, and we found that 3 elements: caring, knowledge, or learning, or inquiry, caring, knowledge, and action were the 3 elements that were self-reinforcing and actually produced, if you like, a virtuous circle, but more than that, a spiral, which created values change and values development in those that had studied it. So I'm sort of asking you, experts in values, if you could comment on this. Do you have an approach to changing values, or do you just measure them? And if you have an approach, what would it be?
Thank you, Adelaide. Would you like to take that one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, and this is, I could be paraphrasing Tim here basically, but essentially, the first thing I'd say is that values, we all have all the values. So we would never be changing people's values. You already have extrinsic values in you. You already have intrinsic values in you. What we are doing is helping you reordering priorities. Okay, so we're not changing values, we're shifting values priorities. And the way in which you engage, the way in which you strengthen values is by engaging them. So you prime a value, and that becomes important for you in the moment. If you keep priming that value over and over again, so you keep engaging that value, it strengthens. The way we tend to think about values is like a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it becomes over time. So that's essentially the short end of it. I don't know if Tim has anything extra to add, but that's certainly in terms of the way that we're engaging with NGOs is trying to understand their role in shifting values in Australia, and their role is to make sure that they aren't engaging those extrinsic values, because every time they engage those extrinsic values, every time they say you should put solar panels on your roof, look at how much money you save, you are engaging and you are strengthening that value over time. We've got enough influences encouraging us to think about engaging our extrinsic values. You don't need to compromise joining.
The only thing I would add is that there's also the issue of threats. So it's not, don't forget the causes of values focus is not just the social modeling, which would involve a lot of the priming that Mark just talked about, but also the sense of helping to build a broader sense of safety and security. And this is something that NGOs can also be working on in a variety of different ways. Or when people, or another way to think of it is that when threats do come along, if the automatic reaction is to act in an extrinsic fashion, it's another point of intervention for NGOs where they can diminish the likelihood that when people are threatened, that they will act extrinsically. Okay, so to give people some other options. I looked again at my nation after the September 11th attacks. People felt obviously under threat. They moved in an extrinsic fashion. But if there had been intervention at that point by lots of NGOs to say, well, wait a second, this is an opportunity for us to really rethink the way that we want to go and how we're going to react in this situation of threat. That would be another way where you could diminish the likelihood that people would focus in an extrinsic way, broadly speaking.
And just sorry, on that one, with climate change communications, something that we've been doing is pointing out the threat of climate change and how it's going to ruin the world, we're all going to die. And obviously, how does that make you feel? And if we know that feeling insecure is linked to increased materialistic extrinsic values, then that could also be an issue. Obviously, we need to balance the threat with the focus on.
I've been guilty of that. I run climate change think tanks and I've been running them for quite a few years, and you watch the room slump as you give them all the data about what the climate science is saying, and particularly if you don't link that with what you can do about it, some sort of sense of agency, people get really depressed, and that's not a good place to act from. Do we have a question from our colleagues in Perth this time? Oh, it's on the chat, is it? Sorry. Okay. I can read it out. So, question for Tim from Perth. Have you identified a list of intrinsic values that are most powerful in reaching people around climate change messages?
I would say no. We've not taken a look directly at that this value is more important or more powerful than the others. The ones that I would say are sort of most obvious would be probably the community values. But so here's another thing about the common cause approach, or a common misconception around the common cause approach. So we still do believe in segmenting audiences, but we believe in segmenting them in ways to figure out what the best way to activate intrinsic values is in that audience, okay? So it may be that for some individuals, the best value to activate would be an affiliation family sort of value. It might be for another group that the best way to activate is a health value. Health is an intrinsic value in our data as well. It might be in another group that the community feeling universalist values is a good way to go. So I would argue that it's better to be thinking through for these kinds of individuals what is the right set of intrinsic values to activate given what we know about them and what they care about. So I hope that answers the question. Young man over there. Well, the young man over there.
Oh, yeah. There we go.
My question is basically, anyway, will rich people or politicians or anyone important ever care about this consumerism, global warming, anything about this? Will they care about it now? Will they care about it later? Or will they never care about it?
Well, I think we got to give this guy a hand. He goes right to it. I believe it's possible that they would, and that's why I do what I do. If I didn't believe that it was possible to make change, I wouldn't be here in Australia giving 12 talks in a month. Because I believe that when we take a look at history, there are lots of things that seemed impossible, but eventually happened. So, for example, in my country, it's only 150 years ago that black people were slaves. Only 100 years ago, women, your mom, didn't have the right to vote. How old are you? 100 years ago, it would have been legal for you to work in a factory 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. Now, those changes took a lot of work, and they took long pre-movements sometimes. It took a long time until there seemed like it was 10, 20 years of people banging their head against the wall. And then oftentimes when change happens, it changes quickly because those pre-movements happened. So that history gives me some hope. The other thing that gives me hope is that when it all boils down, we're not actually asking people to do things that are going to make them less happy. Okay? Remember that the intrinsic values not only promote sustainability, but they also promote a more civil society, and they also promote more happiness. And I think part of the trick is to focus around that and to get people engaged around that. And the more that this has been a change in my thinking since around the time you were born, where I used to think you change people's values. Now what I think is that we change our lives and we change society here and there to make it easier to live our intrinsic values. Just like we need more bike lanes so people can ride their bikes, we need more opportunities to live our intrinsic values. And I think there are some really winnable battles out there. I really think that advertising to children and banning it is a winnable battle. I really do. I know he's shaking his head no, but I think that it is something that's possible because people get it. And I think if we can do that, and then we can do the next thing and the next thing. Here's the other thing I believe about politicians, and it's cynical. Just going to warn you, this is a cynical statement. But if enough people want something to happen, there are enough people out there who want to get elected who will run in order to get those votes. So if we can make those changes, then I believe that more politicians will come forward. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that's likely to happen or that it's going to be easy to happen, but I think it is possible for it to happen. So that's my answer to you. I hope you'll keep that in mind. She was next, and then we can go to Mr. Thank you. Do you believe it? Can I ask you a question? Can I ask you? Did you believe anything I said?
Yeah.
Okay.
I did.
It's a question for Tim. I wonder if you could comment on the value-action gap. Which is what I understand to be people that hold environmental values and attitudes,
Right.
but don't actually act on them.
Yeah. So the core, and it's not just environmental literature either, by the way. There's all kinds of evidence that shows that people say, well, I think this is important, but then they don't actually behave that way, right? It's not just for the environment. First off, I would note that at the valuesandtrains.org website, there's a downloadable short report about that was written by Greg Mayo, M-A-I-O, that you might find interesting and want to download. Here's the thing, is that most of the value action gap research is looking at how a dispositional value predicts a specific behavior which happens in a particular moment. Now, the problem with that research design is that who knows what was just primed in the person's mind as they went in to engage in that action. And furthermore, if you've only measured one value, but you haven't really taken a look at the whole value pie, like it might be that I say X is really important, but it's also the case that I think Y and Z are equally or even more important, okay? And so if I haven't, as a researcher, taken that into consideration, I've got error in my data, which is going to reduce the size of the correlation that I can find between value and the action. That's the first problem. The second problem is that values come into action because something internally activated that value in the moments preceding the activity. And so really, I think that the problem is we haven't been studying the question correctly. What we should be studying is a person with this set of values who who is then having that set of values activated either because of internal or external circumstances, increasingly likely to behave in a value congruent way. And from what I understand of that research, I'm not saying the value action gap disappears, but it becomes much less wide. Okay, so I think that that's the fundamental problem with that research literature. It's too focused on the dispositional value. It's not enough focused on the whole value system, and it's not focused on what activations have occurred in the time before the action was committed. And I think if you could take more of that into consideration, you'd have better predictive ability of when somebody does an action or not. Does that make sense? Okay, thank you.
This is a question that is not just a play on words. Use the word congruent in your answer. Yes. Have you ever heard of the growing transfer in your visits to Australia?
I've only been in Australia for 2.5 weeks.
Well, I'll ask Mark to perhaps answer. I haven't finished yet. Your question. Okay. I exaggerated when I said, I didn't agree with anything or understand anything you said. One of the points, or the point that I keep shaking my head about is, just as you 12 years ago, in reference to our questioner, said that you changed the idea about how intrinsic values could be altered and that we had them inside us. I've been working on that for perhaps 30 years, and so I'm glad you've made the switch. More importantly, Mark, coming from advertising, as I did in the distant past, and also being exposed to the growing transfer in Australia, would like to feel that perhaps whilst in Brazil and in North America, we may need that children's advertising after a sort of the educational aspects of the growing transfer. You may find that the children, as I find myself, are able to look at the ads with a great deal of scepticism and enjoyment and say, these poor fools are wasting their money. It doesn't impress me. I can see their tricks they're playing on me. So, if I could that's the reason behind it. Could I just ask you, Mark, does your Common Cause Australia, you're practicing what I believe is the essence of things, which is getting to the people, bringing out of the people what's intrinsically in them, rather than spooking them. And do you find, and this is the growing transfer question, do you feel that the growing transfer is, in a sense, an antidote to what's happening in advertising?
If I could just say one thing, the research evidence shows that children under 12 generally don't understand persuasive intent. And so while you as an adult may be able to see through some of that, trust me, a 4-year-old generally cannot.
Yeah, so growing transfer is an effect, and probably an American thing, term originally, which is around you walk into a shop and all of a sudden you don't know what you're doing in your hands, you keep buying things. And you went in one purpose and you end up buying the whole shop. And Growing Transfer is a show in Australia which is developed by a comedian which is aired on ABC, a public broadcaster, which is currently under attack by our government, which links to thinking about, well, there's only a limited audience for the ABC first. And people who watch the ABC are probably going to have a slightly different values disposition than people who don't, in part because they watch the ABC, so they're not exposed to as many advertising on News Corp and Channel 10 and so on. But that is a good point, because we have these, and I think Tim was talking about the importance of educating children and yourself on how advertising works. I certainly had that. I had an education on how advertising worked more when I worked at the advertising magazine, because in part I judged awards, and I saw advertisers talk very explicitly about the manipulation techniques and how proud they were of them. It was absolutely scary. And I saved some of them, sort of secretly photocopied them and put them away if I could use this one day. And I'm not coming to that point now, which is good. So yeah, the techniques they use are not all things you always know about. Limited people who would watch it. We have a government at the moment which is cutting back the ABC, probably because it does play that sort of role. It is a bit of an antidote, but that's where, you know, campaigns to save the ABC, personally, I think that's intrinsic. That's a campaign for intrinsic values in Australia, because it will give people access to entertainment that has much advertising.
Any questions on this side?
Well, we're a bit over time. We're needing to wrap up, so I could probably take one more if there's one over that side. Any? No.
Anybody else? Okay.
All right, well, we might draw it to a close then. Thank you very much for participating and for staying till the end, and particularly want to thank our special guests, Tim and Mark, for sharing their wisdom with us tonight. Thank you. And thank you to our colleagues in, is that Perth there still? See you later, Perth. Thank you.